Text for today is our lesson from John, and particularly these words of Jesus. By this, all people will know that you are my disciples if you have love for one another. So we are kicking off a new sermon series that is entitled You're Not Christian. And I had kind of a lot of fun writing this and coming up with the title. When I told Julie what the title was, she said, that's dumb. But I wrote it hoping that it would intrigue you into the point that I was trying to get across, this idea of what it means to be a Christian. So we already dove into it a little bit with the children in the children's message, but I want you guys to think about it as well, right? So if I asked you, for example, to define what an American is, probably you guys would do that, and I would guess that you would come up with close to the same answer, although the political party might be different. But as an American, you probably would be able to define that, right? Who thinks you can define American? Raise your hand if you can define it. Okay. And let's say I said, define what a student is. How many of you think you can define a student? And your neighbor would probably maybe agree with you. How many of you could define what a senior citizen is? And have people agree with you. Now, if I divided you into groups of 10 and said, give me a definition of a Christian, how many different answers do you think you'd come up with? My guess is like 11. Right? So I don't know if you ever stopped and thought about this, but this word Christian is kind of a nebulous one. It's one that is actually hard to define because you can be a Christian and be on any side of any issue. Have you ever thought about that? There's Christians who are Republicans, Christians who are Democrats. There are Christians who are fought on both sides of almost every single war that's taken place in the last couple hundred years. Right? There's Christians that have one view of a social issue and Christians that have another, right? And that's because this word Christian is so hard to define. And in fact, if you think about it, what's even more interesting is we're not even entirely sure how you become a Christian. You ever thought about that? Kind of depends in the church that you grew up in, right? In ours, we talk about it. Well, if you have been baptized, you're a Christian. Maybe you should also maybe be confirmed as well, right? But maybe you grew up in a different tradition where you prayed a certain prayer, right? And then you were a Christian, right? Or maybe you grew up you have a Catholic background, right? Which said, well, you're only a Christian if you're in the true church. We're the true church, right? And so we're the only actual Christians, right? And so we have this word that we use to explain and talk about what it means to be a Christian, and yet we don't even know what it means. Now, here's the kind of interesting thing. I don't know if you know this. Did you know that Christians never called themselves Christians? Did you know that? In the Bible, we'll get to this, they referred to themselves as something else. Christians was what the outsiders first started calling the followers of Jesus. It was actually a derogatory term, right? In fact, I was trying to think of examples that I could use of what do outsiders call some other group of people, and I can't think of any that won't get me sent to HR, right? I'm not exactly sure, like, I don't know, like geeks or nerds or, but the best I can think of is, remember when everybody started following the Rolling Stones, they called them deadheads? And that was meant to be a derogatory term, but then they actually adopted for themselves and they're like, no, we like being deadheads. I don't know, I don't even know, pick whatever term you want, but Christians was actually first a derogatory term. And we heard about the first of them here in Acts chapter 11. Right? So Barnabas went to Tarsus to look for Saul, and when he had found him, he brought him to Antioch. So this was kind of cool. I don't know if you caught this in the text, but Jesus tells them at the end of Matthew, he says, I want you to go and make disciples of all nations, right? And a quarter of the book of Acts has passed, and they haven't left Jerusalem yet. That's how great they've been at taking it to all nations. So then, I don't know if you know your history, but what happens? They start persecuting the church in Jerusalem, and so they scatter everywhere, right? And so there's Christians that actually end up in Antioch, and there's some Jewish Christians who go there, and they only talk to other Jewish people, but then we're told there's some Hellenists, some Greeks that actually end up going to Antioch, and God is with them so much that it explodes. There's all these people who are professing to be Christians, and then the Home Office gets word, and they say, well, we better check them out and make sure that they're really believers. So they send Barnabas to check him out. And Barnabas is like, I think so, but I think I'm going to bring Super Saint Saul. Still called Saul. He's going to be called Paul here in a moment. We're going to take him to Antioch. So Saul and Barnabas go for a whole year. They met with the church and taught a great many people. And in Antioch, the disciples were first called Christians. Not called themselves Christians. They were called Christians. The second place it takes place in the New Testament is here. Paul, when he's being tried in Rome before he gets put to death, before Agrippa. Agrippa says to him, he says to Paul, in a short time, would you persuade me to be a Christian? Right? Because Paul's giving his testimony of his faith, and he's saying, are you trying to make me a Christian? Spoiler alert, he's not using that in a good way, right? It's a pejorative. And then what did Peter say in our lesson today? Yet if anyone suffers as a Christian, let him not be ashamed, but let him glorify God in that name, right? So if you're persecuted for being a Christian, right? So this term Christian actually was not one that the early church used on itself. It's one that outsiders used. In fact, we get some pretty cool information from history. Anybody heard of the Roman historian named Tacitus? Okay, well, you're about to buckle up for some history, right? So there's this Roman historian named Tacitus. He wrote in the late 100s, particularly covering a couple emperors, including the Emperor Nero. And if you don't know the story of Nero, one day Nero's sitting around, he's like, Rome is looking kind of ragged and run down. I'd like to rebuild it, but it's hard to make people leave, so I'll just burn the city. So he burned Rome. And spoiler alert, it didn't go well. People don't like that when you burn their homes. So Nero came up with this idea. Tacitus tells us, he says this, consequently, to get rid of the report, in other words, the report that Nero was the one who actually burned Rome, Nero fastened the guilt and inflicted the most tortures on a class hated for their abominations, we'll talk about that later, called Christians by the populace, right? So it's the outside world who called us Christians. In fact, Tacitus goes on to say this. This is kind of funny. He says, Christus, from whom the name had its origin, suffered extreme penalty during the reign of Tiberius at the hands of one of the procurators, Pontius Pilate. Isn't this kind of cool? This is an outside source that says Jesus was killed by Pontius Pilate. But what's kind of funny here is, and some of you are actually, I'm going to make uncomfortable because you're going to realize you thought this your whole life as well. They think Jesus' last name was Christ, right? So there was Joseph Christ, Mary Christ, Jesus Christ. They thought Christ was his last name. They didn't understand that it was a title, right? The messianic title, meaning that he was the anointed one. So they think his last name is Christ. So he's saying this Christ, this guy whose last name was Christ, was put to death, and they're followers of Christus, so we call them Christians. And so that's why I hate to tell you, you are not Christian. Or at least, hopefully you're not. Well, maybe I shouldn't put it that way. Actually, some of you are sitting there hoping that when the whole series is over, he's like, please don't say he's going to make us call us like disciples and he'll never call us Christians again. Maybe. We'll see how that's going to go, right? But just think about it this way. If you're out in the world today and someone comes up to you and asks, hey, are you a Christian? What's your automatic response, right? And now part of it might be depending on who's asking in the circumstance, right? Let's say you happen to be walking by a place where Westboro Baptist is protesting. And a journalist stops you on the street and says, are you a Christian? Now what do you say? Well, yes, but not like those Christians, right? So you rush to answer that question when I said, would you say you're a Christian? But what kind of Christian? Because again, we don't know what that word means. Because it doesn't have a meaning, because it's not used in the Bible. So, spoiler alert, what does the Bible call Christians? Right? And in Antioch, the disciples were first called Christians. This is how they referred to themselves at the beginning. This is kind of interesting. I never really thought about it until I was preparing for this, and maybe I just skipped that day in seminary or whatever, but do you ever think it's interesting, Mark, that only Luke calls the apostles in his gospel? They're always disciples. So I have no idea, but Luke is the one who then says all believers in the book of Acts are called disciples. And I think to distinguish from the original, that's why he calls the original apostles, but all Christians he calls disciples. And the word of God continued to increase, and the number of Christians, no, not the number of Christians, the number of disciples multiplied greatly in Jerusalem. And a great many of the priests became obedient to the faith. And here's another one. When this is after Saul has been called to be called by Christ, and And so he becomes a disciple, right? But he shows up to Jerusalem to tell them. I don't know if you ever caught on to the story. And when he had come to Jerusalem, he attempted to join the disciples, and they were all afraid of them because they did not believe he was a disciple. And I mean, this is crazy. All they needed to give him was a confirmation test. And if he passed it, he was a Christian, right? That's all you have to do. They were afraid and did not believe that he was a disciple. So here's the thing. This is what Jesus calls his followers. He calls them disciples. And if you're not familiar with it, the word disciple, matheia, it just simply means a follower, a pupil, one who learns from another person, right? And in some ways, we take this word disciple, and can seem kind of terrifying, right, to say that word. But at its heart, it just means I'm going to do what this person does, right? So years and years ago, there was that Christian kind of campaign that was, I kind of thought it was corny at the time. What would Jesus do? Anybody ever remember the what would Jesus do? But to be honest, that's what a disciple would ask. Hey, I'm facing this really hard situation. What would you do? Hey, I'm having this conflict in my relationships. What would you do? Hey, I've got to handle this really kind of tough thing. What would you do? And here's the crazy thing about a disciple that I'd suggest you. A disciple of Jesus is willing to say yes before he knows what the answer is. A disciple of Jesus is willing to say yes before he knows what the answer is. In other words, they're not going to go and say, well, I'm going to pick my Bible verse to do what I want to do. You see the difference? A disciple of Jesus is going to do exactly what he does, even if they don't know what it is yet. And so Jesus comes along to his disciples, and he gives them this command. It takes place in John chapter 13. Jesus tells them, he says, now the Son of Man will be glorified, and God is glorified in him. If God is glorified in him, God will also glorify him in himself. Little children, yet a little while I am with you. You will seek me, and just as I said to the Jews, so I will now say to you, where I'm going, you cannot come. Right? So if you want to think about it, it's sort of like this. Any parents sent their kids off to college? Ever sent your kids off to college? So you remember when you're having that last one talk with them, and you're like, all right, here's the most important thing you got to remember. It's these two things that you can never forget. I want these three things to always be, right? You have this, you start with, you can't forget this one thing, and then you're like, well, but there's another important thing, right, added to it. But Jesus is actually going to say, I've said all these things to you. I've said so much to you, but this is the one thing you have to remember. He says, a new commandment I give to you, that you love one another. Just as I loved you, also you are to love one another. And all the disciples were like, duh. I mean, the Old Testament says we're supposed to love one another. That's nothing special. That's nothing new. But Jesus actually began this whole thing by pointing out, he says, remember how he washed their feet, and he says, you don't understand what I have done for you. And I think, this is just me, I think we too narrowly think about that as what I have done for you just now. When really what I think he means is what I have done for you, right? What I have done for you. See, he's sitting among this group of people, right? And he just looks at them and he goes, hey, you guys, you remember when we called Matthew? And the rest of the disciples are like, I remember. And remember we went to his house? Remember who was at that party? Right? And Peter's like, yeah, everyone my mom told me to stay away from was at that party. That's who was at that party when you welcomed Matthew. And I said, but look, we loved him. And now look at Matthew, right? And then he says, Nathaniel, I bet you guys don't even know this story. Nathaniel, when I called Nathaniel, his brother is the one who went and got him. And his brother went and said to him, he said, look, I found the Messiah. And this is what Nathaniel said. You didn't even know I knew this, did you, Nathaniel? Nathaniel said, can anything good come from Nazareth? Right? It's like, can anything good come from Nebraska? Right? I mean, right? I mean, he insulted Jesus' whole family, right? But he said, Nathaniel, no, you're part of mine, right? Jesus says, I have brought you all in, and I have loved you in this way. By this, all people will know that you are my disciples if you believe all the right things. Wait a second, is that the right slide? By this, all people will know that you are my disciples if you believe all the right things. By this all people will know that you are my disciples if you have love for one another. If you have love for one another, right? And what's kind of crazy here is what happens next. I think I put my slides in the wrong order. So the very next thing that happens, did I lose my verse? Maybe I didn't make a slide. All right, I'll read it to you. The very next thing that happens, right? He's just done this whole thing where he talks about they're supposed to be about love, right? Do you know how the disciples responded? Simon Peter said, Lord, where are you going? Right? All Peter cares about is what's Jesus going to do? What's happening next? And then he goes on this big speech. He goes, I'm going to follow you anywhere, Lord. Wherever you go, I'm going to follow you. And Jesus is like, no, Peter, in just a few hours, a middle school girl is going to intimidate you into being ashamed of me, right? Peter, I don't want you to worry about it. And Peter's like, no, I'll die for you. And Jesus says, Peter, you will die for me one day, but I don't want you to. I don't want you to die for me. I don't want you to fight for me. I want you to love for me. And what I'm asking you to do is actually more difficult. Compared to dying for me, loving for me is going to be more difficult. It's going to be a bigger challenge. And I would submit to you that if we as a church had gotten this right, and I'm just talking about like in our Western history, if the church had gotten this one thing right, not the rest of the New Testament, not all the whole scope of what God had taught, if we had just gotten this one thing right, there's no 100 Years' War. There's no World War I. There certainly is no World War II. There's not a civil war. There's not even a need for the civil rights movement. Right? Because what Jesus is saying is he's saying, Peter, I want you to create a group of people that love one another so much that the rest of the world actually can't even comprehend it. That they look at it and they go, it doesn't make any sense. Right? I've been thinking about this for a while, and so this is actually a quote from me. And this is the height of hubris when you put your own quote on a screen, but I would suggest to you this. The disciples of the first 3 centuries were not afraid to love this way because they knew there was no reason to fear death. But Christians of this century in the West are Christians so that they can go to heaven when they die. And in the meantime, what? Right? You've heard my joke before. We're not sitting in the DMV waiting to get our driver's license. We're not waiting for something else to happen. One day God will come back. One day God will call us home. But that's not what we're waiting for. What we're called to do in this moment is to love, right? This is what happened in the early church. The community around them were blown away. They said, look at those guys. Look how the men treat the women. Look how the men treat the women with honor and respect. Look how the women honor their husbands. Look at these Christians. Do you see how they treat widows and orphans? Do you see how they even treat children? Look how slave masters treat their slaves. Look how the slaves are honoring of their masters. Right? It's so contrary, and we're going to unpack this in a couple of weeks. The early church conquers Rome without a single sword or army. And it does it because they have this radical love that changes. It makes people lean in. It makes them say things like, I don't know if I want to be a Christian, but I think I'd be happy if everyone who worked for me is a Christian. If that's how they act. Do you know that Christians, when they make a mistake at work, they actually go and turn themselves in? Do you know they go apologize? Do you know they go on and actually try to make right? Do you know that when Christians hurt someone else's feelings at school, they go and apologize to them? Can you believe that? Like, I don't know if I want to be a Christian, but I hope my daughter dates one if that's how Christian men treat women. The world would be so different if we just tried this. And so I just want you to think about this for a second. One of the challenge questions I have for us is, what if we just tried this for a week, right? Now, you have to hear me say this up front. This is not a means to an end. I don't want you to come back next week and go, I tried loving her for a week and she's still a pain in the neck, right? This is not a means to an end. This is not, I'm going to love people as long as they're lovable. This is not, I'm going to love until. This is not a means to an end. This is what we're called to do. What would it look like if we just loved the people in our life for 1 week? Now, I know what you're thinking. And I'm with you, right? You're thinking, my wife, she's always like, blah, 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 blah. My parents haven't had original thoughts since the 60s. My teenagers, everyone around you is an idiot. You are the smartest person by far. All your political beliefs are correct. You are right about everything. I know it, right? But just let's put that aside for a second. We'll grant that. You're the smartest person. Put that aside. But now, instead of fixing people, instead of correcting people, instead of proving to people, we're just going to love people. What would that look like? Because for Jesus, it was all that he was about. This is what the Pharisees couldn't stand. We spend all the time diving into the theology, they disagreed with this, but this is what they couldn't stand. That he loved the unlovable. And if we could just get this one thing right, think how different the world would be. So the second question is this: are we going to be content just being Christians? Are we going to be disciples? So one of the things we're going to do during this sermon series the next 8 weeks is after the message, we're going to have a minute of reflection, and I'm going to ask you to reflect upon those questions. Those questions actually are also part of our small groups packet that I wrote to go along with our small groups. And I was just standing here thinking about, we have these life groups, and Jesus gave this command that said, they will know you're my disciples while you love one another. What would be can you think of any way we could get together and love one another? Does anybody have any ideas how we could anybody have any ideas how we could get together and love one another? Hey, there's still room in all the life groups to sign up if you would. As God has loved us, so we love one another. Amen.